Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're diving into something that, well, it affects all of us really. The complicated relationship between power and ethics.
Yeah, it's a big one. We'll be looking at how having power can sometimes, lead people down the wrong path.
But also, and this is interesting, how it can actually empower people to do good things.
Right. And a huge part of this is how our cultural background shapes what we even see as ethical when power is involved.
For this deep dive, we've gathered some really fascinating material. We've got academic studies on power dynamics, ethical philosophies.
And some analysis of how corruption actually plays out in different societies. So quite a mix.
Exactly. Our goal today is to really get under the skin of power abuse. We want to understand the different ways we judge it ethically.
And, maybe crucially, how our culture shifts those judgments. You might have some moments where you think, I never saw it that way.
Yeah, and covering how culture can kind of normalize actions in one place. That would definitely raise eyebrows, or worse, somewhere else. Okay, let's get into it.
So let's start with that big question about power itself. Researchers at UNCW, University of North Carolina, Wilmington, they actually ask, does power corrupt or does it enable?
That's a great starting point. It immediately tells you it's not straightforward, not just a force for bad.
Exactly. And they didn't just ask, they designed experiments, like one where they gave people leader roles.
Oh yeah, the token experiment.
I think that's the one. They gave leaders tokens to share with the team and then just watched.
And they measured self-interest by how many tokens the leader kept for themselves.
If a leader took more than 30, they flagged that as pretty self-interested behavior. It's a simple, concrete way to study it.
It really grounds the concept, doesn't it? Taking it from abstract theory to actual behavior.
And what's fascinating is how people even think about power matters hugely. Sassenberg and others found this.
Right. Do they see it as an opportunity, like my chance to get ahead?
Or do they see it as a responsibility? I need to look after these people. Those different mindsets, those approaches lead to very different actions.
That totally tracks. If you think power is your moment, you'll act one way. If you feel the weight of responsibility, you'll likely act another way. And going against the grain a bit, some research, like from Schmid-Mast, suggests that having power can sometimes make people more tuned in to others, more interpersonally sensitive.
Oh, interesting. So it doesn't automatically make you ignore everyone else?
Not automatically, no. Which leads us to the really tricky part. How do we even decide when power is being misused, ethically speaking?
Exactly. That's where those big ideas from ethical philosophy come into play, right?
Precisely. The Nepal paper we looked at explores this. It gives us different lenses: ethical relativism, duty, morality.
Okay, let's break those down a bit. Ethical relativism sounds complex. What's the core idea?
It's basically the idea that what's right or wrong isn't universal. It changes, depending on the society, the culture.
So what's normal in one place might be totally frowned upon somewhere else. Exactly. The Nepal paper gives an example. Maybe a manager using their position for a bit of personal benefit. In some cultures, that might be seen as, well, maybe not ideal, but culturally acceptable, sort of how things are done.
So like a boss giving a promotion to a friend, even if they aren't the best candidate, that might be viewed differently depending on the cultural norms around loyalty or connections.
That's a perfect example of relativism in action. It really challenges that idea of fixed, universal ethical rules.
Okay, so that's one view. What about the others? Duty and morality.
Well, those tend to suggest more fixed obligations. People in power have duties to stakeholders, and there are perhaps more absolute rules about what's ethical.
Less gray area there, maybe. More black and white.
In theory, yeah. The paper also touches on consequence-based ethics, utilitarianism, and egoism.
Egoism sounds straightforward. What's best for me?
Pretty much. It's about the individual's long-term interests. Utilitarianism, though, is about the outcome for the group.
The greatest good for the greatest number. Like public health decisions, maybe.
Exactly. That's a classic utilitarian calculation. Sometimes individuals don't get their preferred outcome, but the overall benefit is seen as higher.
Okay, so we've got consequences. What about just rules? Doing the right thing because it is the right thing.
That brings us to deontological ethics. Deon means duty, basically. Here, the focus is on the rules, rights, respect for others. Certain actions are just right or wrong, period, regardless of the outcome.
Wow, okay. That's a lot of different ways to slice it. How do researchers actually try to measure these different ethical viewpoints in people?
Well, the Nepal paper uses something called the Reidenbach and Robin scale, the R&R scale. It tries to measure these dimensions, Fairness, duty, relativism.
And they used this scale developed mostly in the U.S. and Mauritius.
Exactly, a non-Western context. And that's where things got really interesting, comparing the results to typical U.S. findings.
Right, the Mauritian study. This is where that cultural relativism idea really gets put to the test.
Absolutely. Let's look at one of the scenarios they presented. An employee starts a side business using the employer's name without asking.
Okay, what did people in Mauritius think?
Well, it was nuanced. They generally separated the morality from the cultural acceptability. They mostly thought it was morally wrong, a breach of trust.
What?
But they also kind of understood why someone might do it, culturally speaking, maybe if they felt stuck or opportunities were limited. So disapproval on moral grounds, but understanding of the cultural pressures.
That's a subtle distinction. Okay, what about scenario 2, using political connections for a promotion?
This one really highlighted the cultural difference. Here, people's judgments about the morality were very closely linked to what they saw as culturally acceptable or normal.
So even if it looks like corruption or favoritism to an outsider?
Within that specific Mauritian context, it seemed more culturally justifiable. The study mentioned something about an individualistic culture imposing certain obligations, hinting at norms around using your network, helping your own.
Wow. So the definition of fair or ethical in that situation really had a strong cultural overlay.
It really did. It shows how deeply culture can embed itself in our ethical judgments. Now, there was another one, a manager taking an overseas project for themselves.
Right, by telling their assistant no one else applied, but really they just wanted the trip.
Yeah. And again, people's moral judgment was tied to their perception of cultural norms. It suggested a degree of cultural acceptance, or at least understanding, for managers using their discretion for personal benefit.
Even if universal principles might condemn it.
Exactly. It seemed more normalized, perhaps, than it might be in the U.S., based on the R&R scale results.
It's really quite striking how different the Mauritian findings were from the U.S. studies using the same tool.
It really drives home that point about cultural context. What seems clearly unethical to one person might be viewed through a completely different culturally informed lens by another.
So the big takeaway from Mauritius was culture matters a lot.
Hugely. That cultural relativistic factor was much stronger than in the U.S. studies. It suggests maybe different ethical decision-making models operate in developing economies, especially those with more individualistic cultural traits.
And the idea of duty was less prominent, too.
Yeah, that duty dimension, often significant in Western ethics, seemed less important in Mauritius in these scenarios. Which, naturally, leads us to think about, well, what about things like outright corruption? Is that culturally relative too?
Okay, good question. Let's define corruption clearly first. What is it, fundamentally?
The Zemenovicheva source gives a solid definition. It's the misuse of entrusted power for private benefit. Simple as that. Breaking the trust placed in you.
And they mention different ways to define it. Normative versus positive?
Right. Normative is about deviating from ethical norms or the public interest. Positive is about deviating from legal norms, breaking the actual law.
And the legal one is often used for comparisons, I guess, because laws are more concrete, even if they vary.
Generally, yes. Though what's legal isn't always seen as ethical, and vice versa, of course.
So why is corruption so damaging? What are the real-world harms?
Oh, they're significant. Zemenovicheva lays it out. Resources get wasted on pointless projects instead of schools or hospitals. The economy suffers because decisions aren't based on merit, which scares off investors.
So it makes countries poorer and services worse.
Absolutely. Goods and services become lower quality, less accessible, and maybe even worse is the erosion of trust.
People lose faith in the government, the courts, democracy itself.
Totally. It fuels inequality, cynicism.
Yeah.
It can really damage the whole social fabric. They also distinguish active corruption, offering a bribe, from passive accepting one.
Okay, so where does this stuff tend to thrive? What conditions make it worse?
Well, simply put, where the potential profit is high and the risk of getting caught is low.
Makes sense.
Formal rules, or the lack thereof, are huge. No rules, loopholes, unclear rules, too much discretion for officials, weak enforcement. All these create opportunities.
If the system is confusing or full of gaps, it's easier to exploit.
Precisely. The economic situation also plays a role. If demand for something outstrips supply, or if the government is heavily involved in permits, licenses, regulations.
That creates bottlenecks where bribes can speed things up.
Exactly. Bureaucracy and bribery often go hand in hand when people are desperate to get things done.
And the political environment.
Lack of transparency is key. If you can't see what politicians are doing, it's easier for shady deals to happen. They mention state capture.
What's that?
It's where private companies essentially influence laws and regulations directly for their own benefit. Also, unclear rules around lobbying can blur the lines between legitimate influence and corruption.
Are some areas of government more prone to it?
Yes, things like public procurement, buying goods and services, land allocation, taxes, appointments, local government, these are often hotspots.
It sounds like a perfect storm of opportunity and weak controls.
It can be. And then there are the informal rules, the culture itself. How much does society tolerate corruption? Are certain things just accepted? Those values change slowly.
Which makes it harder to tackle. So we've talked systems, culture. What about the individual? Is there a psychological angle? Is it just bad apples?
The IGIP source addresses this. It pushes back on the simple, it's just human nature idea, although self-interest is obviously part of it.
So what else is going on psychologically?
They talk about psychological conditioning, the rewards from corruption, money, power, status, act as positive reinforcement. You do it, you get a reward, you're more likely to do it again.
And the bad feelings, the guilt.
They suggest the negative consequences might be stored differently in memory, maybe not as immediately powerful as the lure of the reward. Also, people rationalize.
Conscious deviation, making excuses for themselves.
Yeah, maybe feeling they deserve it, or they were treated unfairly, or everyone else is doing it. Some might even get a kind of thrill from bending or breaking the rules.
That's, a bit disturbing.
It is, and peer pressure is huge, or pressure from superiors. If corruption is widespread in your workplace, refusing might mean being ostracized or even losing your job.
Especially if jobs are scarce.
Exactly. Standing against that takes real courage. The paper notes that insecurity, like high unemployment, can make people more vulnerable to this pressure.
And what about the kinds of personalities drawn to power?
IAJP touches on this carefully. Some individuals might seek positions of authority, police, military, politics, partly out of self-serving motives, like ego or a desire for control, rather than purely public service.
And for those people, corruption might align more easily with their motivations.
Potentially, yes. They also briefly mention a possible difference between politicians often focused on results and bureaucrats focused on rules, and how that might affect vulnerability to certain kinds of gray area corruption.
But at the end of the day, psychology alone doesn't explain why some countries have rampant corruption and others don't. Right?
Exactly. The IGIP paper is clear on that. Psychology gives insights into individual behavior, but you need the cultural and systemic context to understand the huge variations between countries.
So it really isn't just about individual choices. What about broader responsibilities? Organizations, society?
Yeah, the Stuckelberger source really emphasizes this shift from purely individual ethics to what they call structural ethics.
Structural ethics? Meaning?
Meaning, it's not enough to just expect individuals to be ethical heroes. We need systems, codes of conduct, clear procedures, strong legal frameworks that make ethical behavior the easier, default option.
So creating an environment where it's easier to do the right thing?
Precisely. Individual and structural ethics depend on each other. You can't really have effective individual ethics without supportive structures, and structures are meaningless without individuals acting ethically.
Who holds the responsibility for building these structures?
Stuckelberger points to several groups. Governments obviously need to create and enforce fair laws. Businesses need to look down their supply chains, ensure ethical standards are met.
And consumers? Do we have a role?
Absolutely. Our purchasing power matters. Choosing ethical products, fair trade, bio, etc., sends a powerful signal. And investors too, socially responsible investing puts real pressure on companies.
So it's an ongoing effort across the board.
Yes. They frame it as a continuous process. Assessing standards, improving systems, promoting ethical behavior. It's never really done.
Okay, this is all fascinating at a societal level. Can we bring it down to a specific field, maybe education? How do these power dynamics play out there?
Our last source, by McPherson, does exactly that. It brings political philosophy into the discussion about educational administration.
Political philosophy, how does that fit?
Well, political philosophy is really about critically thinking about power, authority, justice, how we organize ourselves politically. McPherson argues it's often missing in educational leadership talk, sometimes confused with just political ideologies.
So philosophy as a tool for analysis rather than a specific political stance.
Exactly. It helps question assumptions, evaluate claims about power in schools, think about the rightness of practices, and uncover how underlying power structures shape education. They stress that ideologies aren't absolute truths either.
What kinds of concepts from political philosophy are relevant?
Things like authority, obedience, justice, sovereignty. McPherson also mentions different ways justifications for educational policies are made appealing to the common good or social contract ideas.
Okay.
And there are also more critical approaches, drawing on thinkers like Marx or Foucault, that aim to deconstruct existing power realities and champion marginalized groups within education.
And they make a distinction between administration and leadership.
Yes, the legitimacy is different. Administrative power often comes from policy, sanctioned from above. Leadership legitimacy is conferred by followers, from below. It's a useful distinction when thinking about power in schools.
It's really interesting to see how these quite abstract philosophical ideas about power can provide tools for understanding something as concrete as running a school.
It really does. It shows these concepts aren't just theoretical. They have real-world applications everywhere.
Okay, so let's try and wrap this up. It's been quite a journey through power, ethics, culture.
It has. I think the key takeaway is just how complex power's influence is. It's not inherently good or bad, but its effects are deeply shaped by individual psychology, cultural context, and the structures we put in place.
Right. And those ethical frameworks, relativism, duty, consequences, they give us lenses to evaluate it. But the Mauritian study really showed how much cultural relativism complicates things. What looks wrong here might seem normal or at least understandable somewhere else.
Absolutely. And corruption, while maybe universally seen as harmful and its effects wasted resources, lost trust. Its roots are tangled in everything from legal loopholes and economic conditions to psychological factors and societal tolerance.
And fighting it isn't just about individual morality. It requires structural changes, responsibility from governments, businesses, consumers, investors, everyone.
And as the education example showed, applying philosophical tools to critically examine power can be valuable in any field.
So a final thought for you, our listener, to maybe chew on. How does your own cultural background influence how you judge ethical behavior when power is involved?
Yeah, what are those implicit rules or norms that shape your gut reactions? And how might they differ from someone in a completely different context? Thinking about that balance, individual responsibility versus societal influence, is crucial as we navigate ethics and try to foster better systems.